Hi, everybody. Welcome to another session of Caltech Center for Technology and Management Education's Making AI Possible. Uh, Quick ad, Caltech CTME, we are a world-class executive education center centered on Caltech's campus in Pasadena, California. We host various global companies all the way from large Fortune 500s down to startups and smaller organizations, but also for individuals to advance within AI, systems engineering, and other different technical fields. But today, we're not here really for the classes. We're here to dig into the geopolitics of AI. And to set the scene, think of it like this. A chip is designed in the United States. It can be manufactured in Taiwan and installed in a data center in Washington. Months later, this model can be trained on that hardware, and it runs a credit decision for some small business owner in Sao Paulo, Brazil. But somewhere between these points sits a set of choices. And that's what we're here to talk about today is who gets access to the compute, who governs these rules, and who ends up building on top of those. And I couldn't be more excited to invite Scott Bade, Senior Analyst at Eurasia Group's Geotechnology Practice, who tracks this from Washington's end. And then also Philipe Moura, Director of Strategy and Sales for Eurasia Group in Brazil, and tracking this in Latin America. And we're looking at the technology from a US perspective, Latin America perspective, and all of the different areas that it hits. So welcome to Making AI Possible, Scott and Philipe. Scott, I would love for you to dive into one, Eurasia Group from your end, and a little bit about your background to set up the conversation for today.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be with you and your guests, or your audience. Eurasia Group is a geopolitical risk firm. I sit in Washington. The firm is based in New York, but we have offices around the world. And really, our goal is to help our clients, who include investors, it includes corporates, it includes nonprofits, understand what's going on in the world and how that affects their business and their operations. So that can be investors who are trying to understand how geopolitics moves markets and oil prices and things like that. It can be corporations which are trying to plot out scenarios and understand the geopolitical risk in different regions or different sectors. And then it's operationally. There's a conflict going on in the Middle East. How is that going to affect you? What does that mean? Or what is the future of U.S.-China relations going to mean for your business? So it's a really interesting field, and we get to look at it from a lot of different angles.
And Felipe, a little bit about yourself and where Eurasia Group is in Latin America and portfolio that you oversee.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys, speaking directly from Brasilia in Brazil. So, as you mentioned, Nick, I lead the strategy and sales for Eurasia Group in Brazil and Latin America. My job is to take our research and our analysis, some of our policy views, which, if you don't mind me saying, among the best in the world. And to make sure that we can translate those into actionable insights for our clients that both help them avoid risks. And this is looking at their long-term investments, at their more strategic decisions, as well as to take, before anyone else, the opportunities that will arise from changes in politics and geopolitics. So this is what we do here. We have a few offices scattered throughout the region, a team of over 60 people doing just LATAM. So very excited to be here. And regards to my role in AI, I've been in technology policy for almost 20 years now, the last 10 of which have been doing AI. And as you know, I helped found Brazil's National AI Association, then served as the first vice president for 5 years. I was a board member, and now I'm just a member. But I still very much participate in the legislative debates across not just Brazil, but a lot of geographies as well.
Excellent. Felipe, thank you. So we're going to move the conversation first out of Washington, D.C., and then we're going to move a little bit further south on how that impacts Latin America and AI stance. So Scott, kind of teeing it up for you, how would you describe current U.S. posture on AI right now? How do you go about looking at such, a behemoth from the infrastructure, from the modeling standpoints to the import and export restrictions? Kind of the floor is yours, essentially, to talk about that.
Sure. So my team, I sit on the technology team, and so we really have we're doing a lot of thinking about how the policy outlook is going to affect both tech companies, but then also non-tech companies, right? So we're translating what's happening in technology multiple directions. I think in the U.S., there's a few different both policy and political things going on. One is that there has been a broader move that Silicon Valley has sort of learned about politics. For many years, Silicon Valley tried to stay away from Washington. They wanted Washington to stay as far away from it. Don't tax us, don't regulate us. Really, you saw this kind of through internet and the rise of apps and the smartphone. There was a impetus to stay away. What has happened, what has changed, I think, in the last maybe 5 years or so, 5, 6 years, is there's been a realization in Silicon Valley that tech companies can get something from Washington. That especially as tech has become a lot more physical and requiring infrastructure, requiring chips. Not that it didn't before, but before that wasn't a limiting factor. Now it is. And so when tech needs things now, and it's not just that, it's also things like procurement and getting into the Pentagon and defense contracts. It's sales overseas. What Silicon Valley has realized is that they can bet on Washington, and that's very political. And so what you've seen in the last couple of years, and that's been supercharged in the last year and a half under the Trump administration, is really this very political relationship now with Washington. So I say that to sort of as a preamble that I think that things are it's a lot more about deal making, a lot more about politics. That being said, that has driven, I think, the Trump administration up until this point to be very hands off on AI. They have been very aligned in the last year, and the industry needing Washington support on things like permitting reform and energy build out, exports and support for exports of chips, etc. What's happened is the president really sees that as an important priority for him. He sees AI. He's been convinced by the people in his administration. He brought a lot of Silicon Valley people into Washington, into the administration, and he's been convinced that the AI boom is important for national competitiveness, but also and national security, but also the stock market. And clearly, there's a political reason to like the stock market continuing to go up and up. So for all those reasons, Trump has really supported the AI boom and have been very light touch, not wanting to regulate very much. That's changing. I think we've hit a peak of sort of the laissez-faire sort of accelerationist policy, as it were. And you're seeing pressure from a bunch of different sides, from Republicans, from Democrats, from the states, to start regulating and to start taking a more active role in policy. And so we're now past that point, but I think we're starting to see that.
Now, Scott, kind of in our conversations we've had in the last couple of days, I like the way that you think about this and thinking in layers, because it can seem quite overwhelming at certain times to say, okay, where is policy on different levels of the AI value chain? And can you talk a little bit about your methodology on how you look at it in layers?
Sure. So I think with AI, you really need to look at it, I think in two ways. You have layers and inputs, right? So the layers are where in the value chain of AI are you regulating? Are you looking? And so I think of both from a choke point standpoint of who controls the layer, and then there's also a regulatory standpoint potentially as well. And sometimes those are the same thing. But those layers really stack up on each other, and so you have compute, you have data, you have energy and water, you have talent, and all of those you can regulate in different ways, you can pursue in different ways. And so there's a political economy of those that are important both from a domestic policy regulatory perspective, but also for a geopolitical competition. And so if you're a policymaker sitting in Washington, you're having to think about, as you think about AI, are you regulating the the developer side, the application side? Are you drilling down and looking at the compute? You know, a lot of the fight in the United States in the domestic politics has been around data centers and energy costs. And I have to say that I'm not sure if 2 years ago I would have predicted that was where the big regulatory choke point on AI was going to be. But that has captured the public imagination. We're in an affordability crisis. Even if the data centers aren't actually driving energy costs in specific locations that, you know, maybe making a marginal difference at best, the politics is really easy. And you can scapegoat and you can point to this big thing that people don't like for other reasons. And that becomes a manifestation. And so right now in the US, it is tending to be attacking the energy layer rather than trying to regulate on other parts. Not that that regulation isn't happening, and you are seeing that in a variety of ways. But that is where it is. That's where it's sitting right now.
Yeah. Yeah, given the framework that you're talking about, where does the U.S. sit on chips and compute now? I feel this is kind of something that's definitely changed from the Biden administration's restrictions to a little bit of opening up under Trump. Can you give kind of an overview or maybe a 101 on chip and export controls? I think that's an important area to dive into.
Sure. So, you know, the history of export controls is very long. It goes back to the Cold War, and really originally was around things like nuclear materials and keeping them out of Russian hands. They were resurrected sort of as the U.S.-China tech competition was heating up, and that was really in the late 2010s, and that was in the first Trump administration in the telecom space, and that was around Huawei and 5G and keeping the Chinese out of U.S. telecom networks. And you know, once you kind of figure out you have this mechanism that is useful in this way, it really got weaponized in the last two presidencies now, where it's been applied to semiconductors, semiconductor equipment, semiconductor inputs. And so what you saw is a rise of putting export controls on China, trying to prevent them from having the most advanced chips, the most advanced compute. The theory being that if you can keep China a generation behind or 2 generations behind, compute is where you'll win the fight, so to speak, on AI. And so if you yes, China might catch up, but it'll be as long as you have that lead, you can keep maintaining it. And then, you know, as long as TSMC and you know, chip makers keep advancing the technology, then you can keep staying ahead, right? And that was the theory that undergirded Biden's policies. And he had this chip diffusion framework that never actually got implemented, but was going to really dole out AI chips to different countries. And there's a bunch of very complicated criteria. What's interesting is that the narrative flipped under Trump in that he still maintains export controls on the highest end chips, chip making equipment, and some of the components. The difference now is that the Trump administration's strategy is to say, we are going to outcompete the Chinese, and we're going to do that by getting everyone hooked on our technology and on our chips, on our infrastructure, on the AI stack, if you will. And so that's where you get the headlines that you've been seeing in the last year or so, where exporting chips to the UAE, this NVIDIA going to China, you know, Jensen Huang going with Trump to China to sell chips. Now, they still are not the most advanced chips, and the Chinese, funny enough, have not actually purchased any of the chips that they've been licensed to buy. And we can get into why that is, but there was a shift. There was a real reversal in strategy in this idea of, if we flood the world with our AI and our AI ecosystem, that we can keep people, and that'll give the US the advantage. And so that's been now the strategy. The interesting thing politically is that a lot of the China hawks in Congress on both sides of the aisle think that the Trump administration has gone too far. And so now there are a number of bills that are going through that may or may not pass. And some of them are in the defense authorization, the NDAA, and we'll see what gets taken, stays in or stays up. But essentially, it's Congress trying to limit what the White House can do, and essentially saying, okay, that's enough. We don't want, there's a limit to what we want China getting. But certainly it's been a shift in strategy. Whether it'll work, I think, is undetermined. The US is still in the lead, but China is catching up, and part of why China is catching up is because they are more competitive on some of these other layers. So they're willing to put as much energy as they think they need, and so maybe they don't have the most advanced chips, but if you have, they can architect compute in different ways by not caring as much about emissions, right, and energy. So you have different, again, different inputs, and how you use those different inputs ends up making a big difference in the competitiveness and the outcome.
Thanks for that analysis. So, moving a little closer to home between federal and U.S. states, are there any states that you find that are naturally ahead when it comes to increasing the amount of investment or being able to create a welcoming environment for a lot of the AI development? What are those states that we're looking out for? And what are those states that are pushing back up a little more?
Sorry, U.S. states or federal? Sorry.
Yeah, U.S. states, sorry.
U.S. states, yeah. So I think, the state dynamic is really interesting for a number of reasons. One is that Congress is not legislating really on AI. And so what you're having is states at the state level, regulatory level, having to deal with AI live in a way that Washington hasn't yet. And so they're being forced to move forward on policymaking. And so the result is you're getting a bit of a patchwork, and you're having different states prioritize different things. And so sometimes that's more defensive, sometimes that's more trying to get more business. So you do have states that are trying to incentivize data centers. So Utah and Texas, for example, have they have incentives, fiscal incentives to get companies to build data centers. You have other states that have decided, that politically do not like data centers, do not want that, and so are, have either there's no state has actually banned data centers, although there have been states that have almost banned Maine almost banned data centers, and then it was vetoed by the governor. New York just approved a 1-year moratorium. So you are seeing restrictions that way, or restrictions on energy and saying, okay, you can build data centers, but you have to protect ratepayers. And then you have states like California, I think, that are so important in AI, and California, I have trouble seeing a governor in California ever saying no more data centers. As liberal, as progressive as California is, it's just too important for the economy. And actually the same thing in Virginia. Virginia is a very important data center state. And there it's less about, I think, the tech and innovation and more about national security, because the Senator Warner in Virginia in particular has been vocal on this, but the political leaders of Virginia tend to be very attuned to national security and understand that you do need data centers for competitiveness reasons, for security reasons. So I think that there's a mix of states and how they act, and then on actual AI regulation itself, you have a variety of different priorities, whether it's in Tennessee, where they care a lot about copyright and likeness and protecting, singers, right? That's where, because of Nashville and copyright. And then you have states that have just experimented in different ways, and Colorado has experimented with more comprehensive, more sort of risk-based approach like Europe. California has obviously done a lot on AI safety, but done it in a way to try to be responsible with the work with the AI companies, and you saw New York actually follow California's approach, because the original law bill in New York was very strict, and then basically they looked at California and said, okay, Governor Hochul looked at California and said, okay, can you do what California did, and we'll go with that, and that's what they did. So you're seeing different approaches and different things. I think the big narrative is that the states versus federal, on this idea of preemption, and that's been a really contentious issue in the current administration.
Okay. Thank you for that, Scott. So let's take this down south a little bit, and Scott, we'll give you a second to get a glass of water as we look at Philipe's perspective, and then we'll kind of bring it in from there. And if you did ask a question in the chat thread, we'll get to it at the end. Keep the questions coming. I'll kind of try to put them in where it makes sense, and then we'll have kind of a little more participation. So Philipe, does Brazil have value within an AI stack, specifically like energy for compute, data, the model layer? Like, where does Brazil sit in the stack that Scott's been talking about?
Thank you, Nick. And before I answer about Brazil, allow me to paint a more global picture before I
Please
get
do.
there,
Please.
because I think it's going to make the story behind Brazil and Latin America easier. Let me introduce a concept that was coined here by Erasure Group's founder Ian Bremmer. He talks about a G0 world. A G0 world is a world where no individual player or group of countries are at the same time interested and able to work as guarantors of the international system, of the international order. And we so our founder made that prediction about 12, 15 years ago, and we're getting there. And one of the things about this fragmented geopolitical world that, like the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said in the Davos meeting, and I quote him, "Nostalgia is not a strategy." This old world order that we've seen for the past 30 years is not going back. That's broken, and that ship has sailed. And the context of that, the positive news for Brazil and for Latin America is that hard assets are back. Of course, we are not going to not be looking at the digital economy, and I have a few sentences about that as well. But in a world where critical minerals and rare earths are not just necessary for the AI chips, but also if you don't have those, the fighter jets that secure a lot of countries' borders will not take off. Countries that have different elements of how Scott aptly named the AI stack. And here we're talking about energy, which both Brazil and LATAM are powerhouses in, both renewable. 90% of Brazil's energy matrix is renewable, as well as fossil fuels. We are growing exponentially on oil production in Brazil alone, not to mention a few other Latin American countries. Then, of course, it's access to land, it's access to water, it's even the minerals that will build, the infrastructure layer for the data centers, as well as for the chips that are manufactured in Taiwan or whatever they start being manufactured going forward. So, of course, controlling parts of those issues will or are likely to grow in value over time. And it's no accident that when we look at some big tech players in the past 3 to 4 years, they've been buying and running nuclear plants just to make sure that they have their own steady supply of energy should, whatever bunker scenario some of them could be looking for. So in terms of the leverages that we have here, we definitely have the critical minerals. We have, of course, this is not completely related to AI, but the fact that we contain 28% of the planet's freshwater. We are exports in the ag business, like world export leaders in the ag business, which of course will need compute power, but we'll also need to keep humans fed, right? And so this will put Brazil, which is not super favorably seen by the United States as one of the friendly countries in terms of AI. So when President Biden passed the first row of export restrictions on AI chips, Brazil didn't get into the friendly country territory. Also not in the enemy country territory. We stayed somewhere in the gray zone, in the middle. And another interesting thing about the story, when we think about Latin America, is our high adoption rate. So whichever metric you look, smartphone penetration, mobile internet penetration, adoption of new apps, of new anything, we are early adopters. So while we see in a lot of the developing world the race for AI being pushed either by governments and or by corporations, here the adoption rate is dramatically pushed for and demanded by the people. So the usage starts with them, and actually they're the driving force between companies and governments um, adopting AI. So when you ask me about, how is Brazil positioned, we have fantastic. Do you have time for me to tell a story
We've got a lot
about
of
this?
time. Go for it.
All right. I won't be mentioning the names, but this was a Brazilian startup in healthcare, and they were doing cancer detection through computer vision. And they were developing this algorithm here that had, and this was a few years ago, right? They had an assertiveness rate of, I think these are going to be dummy numbers, but think about in the 93% range, which is pretty high, right? And then they made a partnership with a US based startup that was supported by, one of US's top hospitals that were actually doing the same thing, but, on the other side of the continent. Um, and then they did, they put together an MOU, they did a technical exchange. So they took the US algorithm and ran it against the Brazil data set. They took the Brazil algorithm and ran it against the US data set. Before this exchange, let me put the US assertiveness rate at 95%, so slightly above um, the Brazil one. But when we reversed the data sets using the same algorithm, the Brazil one in the US data set fell to like 87%. And the US one applied to the Brazilian data set fell to less than 70%. Dramatic loss. And of course, the only conclusion that the researchers were able to derive from that is that how homogeneous the US data set was vis-a-vis the Brazilian data set made it a lot less powerful in terms of the diversity of people and how you can detect skin cancer on different skin colors and different DNAs and so on. So the diversity of data that we have here is a really compelling story. But if we have Latin Americans listening to me, we are very familiar with the story of us importing raw, whatever it is, in this case, raw data, and then importing back ready solutions. So of course, governments are concerned about us just becoming exporters of data, but we have the massive waves of adoption. We have some of the hard assets that will make this. That will position Brazil and Latin America in this new AI global race, so to speak. So, of course, we are probably not going to be the top leaders in the development of the cutting edge models. We will have some like extremely specialized verticals, which I think we have great capacity in. But in general, we are not going to be fighting head to toe with American and Chinese big techs. But we have other parts of the chain that if we play our cards right, there will be massive opportunity there.
What are some predictions for Latin America that you have, both on the good and the bad side? And you can be as specific as countries or as general as the region.
I think one thing that is counterintuitive, if you let me start by that, is that when we have these conversations here, and this is a big electoral year for Latin America, by the way, we have already had some really important election cycles, and we still have Brazil's upcoming. But the electoral swings will probably matter a lot less than they appear. The region's political landscape is likely to shift. But what is not likely to shift, at least what concerns the AI stack and its value chain, is the structural relationship with U.S. technology and global capital. So at some point last year, we heard from a president of a major bank in one of the IMF meetings as he was discussing hedging outside of the U.S. And he said, and I quote, if we were 45% allocated in US dollar and US assets, it's not a hard decision to bring it down to 43%. Those 2% or percentage points may not seem like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it actually is a massive amount of money. And what the Europeans, to give an interesting example, are realizing is that their aspirations to become digitally sovereign and completely independent from U.S. big techs is not attainable, at least not to the level that they were aspiring to when we had a group of researchers and NGOs and foundations in 2024. They got together and they built what do they call it? The Eero stack. They called it the Eero stack, which was looking at an even deeper stack of capabilities in this world. I think they were looking at, I have it here. So they were looking at data, software, cloud, IoT and devices, networks, chips, and then the critical resources. So an even wider spectrum of things. And then last year we had Presidents Chancellor Merz and President Macron that got together and started discussing this. But I think the conclusion is, if the European market is big enough that some U.S. firms will concede and make adaptations to their architecture to ensure sovereignty. I don't think that this is going to necessarily be the case for LATAM. So LATAM, from that perspective, will still need to play their cards right if they want to secure the relationship between U.S. Technology and global capital. On the other hand, and this is us going back to the Dawn Row Doctrine, which is, by the way, another term coined here at Eurasia Group. When we're looking at the Dawn Row Doctrine, the closer you are to the south border of the U.S., the more likely it is that the U.S. government will maintain a close watch on those countries' technology policies. And the lower south you are in South America, the less strong that hold will be. And so China will likely come here with more investments, and they're probably very happy to get more and more people adopting, right, their techs. My second prediction, if you want to put it that way, is that the global constraint on data center expansion is more likely to be affordable and renewable energy at scale. While Brazil has 90% of renewable, Latin America has between 60 and 65 of power coming from renewables, which is roughly twice the global average. So that is already worth mentioning. Besides, great talent, besides land, besides water. And so just like if we were to look at the rare earths industry like 10 to 15 years ago, or even before that, this was not an economically viable industry for most places, simply because China dominated 90%. They have 50% of the reserves, 90% of the production of the high-powered magnets that come from rare earths, and it basically made no sense for any other country to try to penetrate into that sector, simply because economically it didn't make sense. But in a fragmented world, which is why I asked when you asked me the question, I asked to go back and do that circle. In a fragmented world, the discussion about building data centers in LATAM actually becomes interesting again. About 15 years ago, we were discussing with the Brazilian government, the Brazilian government's first attempt at building a national data center policy. And remember, this was like in the era of Snowden. This was in the era of privacy regulations like popping up here and there everywhere. GDPR wasn't even approved. It was in discussion. We still had the E-Directive 95 at that time. So we were discussing those things, and the bias of the policy in Brazil back then was to do data localization, which, if you ask any cross-border data specialist, this is something that makes them irk, right? Like, no, we can't have this. So of course that policy didn't go anywhere. And part of the reason was, of course, companies, the investors didn't want data localization. But of course, if I recall correctly, a figure, I was discussing this with a specialist like 2 weeks ago, running a data center in Brazil, this was 15 years ago or so, cost on average 60% more than the cheapest data center you could run in the United States. And this is accounting for the fact that Brazil had cheaper energy and cheaper labor. And even so, it was 60% more expensive. But now the question is not simply economically, like, does it make sense? Does that fit the bill? It's also about am I politically interested in making this industry happen for whatever national security or national interest or economic interest that you want to make available, right? So we are likely going to see, as my second prediction, we are likely going to see a bigger rollout of data centers in the region. But I know I have been speaking a lot, so let me stop here.
No,
Probably have more
this is
questions for you.
perfect because the political component decoupled from the economics and the cost component is exactly where the next question is for both units. So Scott, we'll go first up to the US, all about sovereignty, be it from an organizational level of having AI sovereignty, having your own locally hosted LLMs, all the way to national sovereignty, having models that are not allowed to be used by non-US citizens, like we saw with the first Fable 5 rollout. I would love if you could give us a little overview of what AI sovereignty, however you want to define it, in the US would look like. And then Philippe, I'm going to kind of go over to you for that same question.
Yeah, so I think the sovereignty question, and it's not just about AI, by the way, it's about a lot of technologies that, and Felipe was referring to some of that. Um, you have data sovereignty, you have cloud sovereignty, you have do you control your devices? The US and China are really in a world of their own here, and that they have the US does not control the whole stack, and it will never control the whole stack. And there are acknowledgments of that, but it certainly controls most of its stack compared to any of its friends and allies. And so sovereignty for the US really means a lot of control. Compared to, say, Europe, where sovereignty is probably going to mean something more akin to, okay, maybe you store the data locally, but it's still going to be a US model. It's still going to be probably a US cloud provider on a lot of US infrastructure. So I think for the US, sovereignty means that. Now, the US government's view of sovereignty is, and you've seen some kerfuffle in recent months and weeks between some of the senior people in the Trump administration, kind of contrasting sovereignty with Europe, and they see sovereignty as essentially allies feeding into the US-led tech stack. So on things that the US doesn't have, like the EUV machines, these lithography machines the ASML has, or the chip making that Taiwan does, they want that to feed into the US and be part of an effort that is US-led. That's how I think how the US sees sovereignty. Now, where the US, surprise, surprise, the US can be a little high-handed. I don't think that Washington right now quite understands the perspective of other countries in the same way. There's a bit of a have your cake and eat it moment. And so, just to give an example, with the export controls on Mythos and on Fable recently, which have been lifted, by the way, but those were quite a shock to US allies because this is something that hadn't been done before. That was sort of because the US doesn't have a legislative, real regulatory mechanism for AI safety and AI models. This was the emergency brake pull to stop, right? They found this mechanism that inadvertently showed the rest of the world that, oh, we have a shut off essentially for AI. And by the way, now the US is doling out, not even just the government, but actual specific companies are determining who gets to see these models from a cybersecurity perspective. And so, I've talked to some of our allies, officials in other countries, and these are top G7 kind of countries, and they're basically resigned to thinking, well, I guess we have to just lobby for access and hope that the US is willing to give it to us. And so that's where we're at in some respects, and that there is this issue where you have the need for the safety and access, but then also this realization, I think, within the US that these models are national security concerns, and the national security state wants to hoard that access as much as it can. So there's these different tensions between allies, between safety and national security that are going to be in play in the foreseeable future.
Felipe, what does it look like in Latin America for sovereignty?
I think first thing we need to separate the sovereignty as speech, and that sovereignty as speech is everywhere. and we hear political leaders from both the populist left and the populist right talking about it. But then sovereignty is a clause in a contract, which is the part that actually moves money, is what we or companies and investors should be concerned about. So Brazil's latest iteration of its AI plan actually carries some institutional weight and suggests that federal procurement should push for data sovereignty guarantees, geographic redundancy, and protection against extraterritorial legal exposure. As a matter of fact, we had a recommendation from Brazil's Federal Government Accountability Office, I think just 3 or 4 weeks ago, suggesting that the government actually audits foreign technology providers to the Brazilian government to understand whether they do meet those requirements or not, and if not, what should that imply in terms of investment for the Brazilian government going forward. Then there's the third part of what sovereignty could mean, which is how can you actually try, and I think try is the operative word, right? How can you actually try to regulate what happens within your territory and your investments? And Brazil's draft bill for AI is actually very much similar to the EU AI Act. The final draft of the bill is still being prepared. It's currently stuck in Congress, but in the lower house. But the text that is available, the one that has been discussed, is very similar to the one in Europe. And of course, even the Europeans are reconsidering whether it was a good idea to adopt it exactly the way that it was, right? So begs the question of how and when should we be doing it. So all three things are intertwined and being mentioned at different levels of depth. And in a sense, I think if we take it out of Brazil and try to think it more like a macro scale, we are likely to see, I think, going forward, a competition for standards, so the Brussels effect. And I think the Brazil draft bill is an example of the Brussels effect. It's not approved yet, but in any case, we are likely to see more technological fragmentation, and this paired with the sovereignty question. If you are a Brazilian investor or entrepreneur or business owner, can you simultaneously, you can today, but going forward, will you be able to buy solar panels from a factory in China and AI models from a US provider at the same time? The question of choosing your providers and your suppliers, for even if that's not a part of your core business, will also be geopolitical decisions going forward. So of course, Brazil being in its neutral or sort of neutral, G77, as us in international affairs study, right? As in the leaders of the non-aligned movements, as Brazil posits itself to be every now and then. Brazil could be developing pendular policies, as in like we did in the middle of World War II, as in let's understand between the 2 or 3 major powers. Let's see who gives us the best conditions, the best technologies, the best capacity buildings. So to put it in a nutshell, the sovereignty discussion will not be about how can we be independent. It will be what levels of dependence will we tolerate and where.
That's really well stated, Felipe. Well, this is the natural time for questions, because Felipe, the next one's at you. Having tracked your career for probably, the last 12, 13 years, the main common thread I see is governance, be it data governance, AI governance throughout your career. And this question from James is specifically there. So I'll read it out loud kind of for folks who are listening. James says, a lot of leaders and business decision makers are hesitant to clearly define on whose shoulders the responsibility for AI solutions will rest. Who by name is going to be held accountable when something AI source goes wrong? And he caveats that by saying, and Philipe, this is why I thought of you, is do you see something similar to the fiduciary responsibility in the financial sector? So we have something like CPA, Certified Financial Planner, becoming a national standard for AI practitioners. What do you see? Like, from a governance perspective, who's accountable when the system gives you an output? Like, first thing I think of is the popular Air Canada chatbot that, gives a refund, and then the person goes to the desk and they don't get a refund because the chatbot said they would, and next thing you know, you're in tribunal court and they rule against Air Canada. The chatbot is the voice of the business. In situations like that, who's going to be accountable, and how do we create that type of standard?
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, James, for the question. Let me preamble that by saying very briefly on Project Glasswing, which took over the news, still on the news somewhat, but in the past 2 months or so. I think if we look at the phases of AI in the past 70 years, in my perspective, this is my own personal take, we are departing the hype section of Gen AI, as I look at all the wonderful things it can do for me, and then moving into a governance phase, which goes directly to James's question, as in, hey, we are probably still going to have all those wonderful things, but what about the things that we don't want, or how can we diminish the possible negative effects that these will or could have for societies, for businesses, for governments. I don't think, James, there is a clear answer for that. The positive side of that is nobody knows, which means we could still get it right. The negative side of that is we can't learn from somebody who did something right. We can learn for people who are probably going into directions that we don't want to go. But even before, I think we see some of that coming from government, my take is that companies will be taking the lead in terms of putting their own corporate purposes and perspectives on the table very transparently. I won't be citing the names, but there's a major car manufacturer, European one, not one, not two, but exactly 10 years ago, this was July 2016, they published a press release saying that if you buy one of their cars, nobody was talking about automatic cars like self-guided cars in 2016, but they said, when this happens, if you buy one of my cars, we guarantee that the car is going to be aimed at protecting you and your family, the people inside the car, vis-a-vis everybody outside. This is not inherently right or inherently wrong, but if you're buying their car, you know what you're getting, right? We go to a tragedy of the commons if everybody decides to buy that car, right? And in some other instances, the companies, this is a US company, they're like, nope, this is not, if anything happens, not our responsibility. Some of the cases involving said company went to a court of law in the US. And last time I checked, all those juries decided in favor of the company and against the driver or the owner of the car, even if it was on auto mode. In 2021, I want to say, during the Paralympics, there was a self-guided vehicle that ran over an athlete. It was not a very grave injury, but still the athlete wasn't able to compete. And the CEO of the company went on national television to apologize to everyone else and say, hey, we're going to see the limits of that. Just 3 examples of world known companies, leaders in their specific segments, being very purposeful and intentional about where do they draw the line and where do they perceive that they should be going. And of course, this is a very difficult question for governments, and I do not envy the policymakers who are going to have to arbitrate that decision, going to point A or to point B. But whether you are an individual choosing which AIs you're going to be using on your day-to-day, or whether you are a business leader choosing which AIs you're going to be putting inside of your company, the era that I think we're entering in the evolution of AI adoption is an era where governance comes first.
Yeah. Philipe, thank you for that. Well, Scott, I know we're running out of time. I'm going to give you the last word. What is one common theme, without naming clients, without naming specifics, what's one common theme you're hearing a lot of companies ask for?
Yeah, I think, well, gosh, one, there's dozens, but I mean, I think companies are, they want a little bit more certainty, right? And I think whether it's on issues like liability, where we don't know yet, and we're grappling toward that, whether it's the courts, whether it's regulators, whether it's these questions of sovereignty and what does that mean? I think that, we're in an exciting time technologically, but it is also, a period where a lot of companies are feeling the onus is on them to figure it out for themselves. And then they're asking government to step in, and they're trying to figure out what that looks like. And then internationally, obviously, it's very much US and China and a few others, but then what does that mean for everyone else? And we've been talking about those implications in Latin America. So I think that that's probably, the uncertainty over how these issues are getting governed, whether that be on the regulatory side or on, being objects of geopolitical competition, I think are really driving, especially institutions to think twice and to really be thoughtful and deliberate about how they're integrating these technologies in. They know they should and should be thinking about it. And look, we get, I can't tell you how many companies that are non-tech companies that we get coming in saying, okay, tell us what we need to know. Tell us how do we brief our boards? How do we brief our C-suite? They're all thinking about that. And I think it has moved from primarily risk maybe 2 years ago when ChatGPT first came out to much more thinking about how do we harness this. But it's the technology always leads the policy making, right? And I think that tension between regulation and governance, and then the geopolitical competition and those other drivers on the other create incentives that don't always lead to neat and tidy outcomes. But that's something that's why our firm exists, and that's why I think I think that it's an exciting time for especially the corporate folks in your audience, the technologists in your audience, to be thinking about how they can work and lead on the policy side, because I do think a lot of this is going to be coming from the private sector and not be led by government.
Well, Scott, if somebody wants to follow you, get a hold of you, what's the best method?
Happy to. I'm on Twitter. I'm on some of the socials, but then I'm happy to. I don't know if you have a chat function to drop an email in.
There should be. You should be able to just put the chat thread right in there.
Great.
As Scott's looking for the chat, which I know when you're on 3 different types of Teams and Zoom and Google, all of them are changing. It's tough. Philipe, what about yourself? How do folks get a hold of you? Oh, you beat me to it. LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn, and I also have Instagram. Let me put both of them here.
Okay.
And
you get all the socials up here.
I do, yeah. I actually end up publishing a lot on AI and governance. So if you like the topic, do follow me.
Perfect. And I will highly endorse Felipe's work. I've been reading it for years. So originally how I think I was able to track you back down. All right. Thanks for all the great work you do at Eurasia Group. I mean, it is definitely the leader around geopolitical risk. And I'm always excited to see, regardless if it's, quick YouTube socials from Mr. Ian Bremmer or, other types of updates from some of your illustrious staff. So thanks a lot, gentlemen.
Great to be with you.